One of the core beliefs and teachings and priorities of Hasidus is Achdus, the unity of God, Achdus Hashem. As you know the story, that Baal Shem Tov was a very, very little boy, 2, 3, 4, depending on the versions. His father passed away, and immediately prior to his passing, he called him to his bedside. The holy Baal Shem Tov's father was very old, and he told him the famous words in Yiddish. He said, Yisraelik, sollst nicht mehr haben verkehren Tag nur von der Ewigen allein, und sollst lieb haben jeden Jiden mit der ganzen Tiefe nicht von deiner Scham. Which means, Yisraelik, fear nothing except for God Himself, and love every Jew with all the depths of your heart, your soul. So in the previous Rebbe's writings, he makes an observation that this will that a very holy sage left for his young boy, who was destined to become one of the great original contributors to Jewish history, in this little will you have all of Chassidus. All of Chassidus is consolidated into these two thoughts, because at its core, Chassidus has two core teachings, or two emphases that, so to speak, set it apart and make it different. The first is the unity of God, which I'm going to explain soon. And the second is Ahavas Yisrael, love a fellow Jew. Tonight's topic is not about Ahavas Yisrael, so I'll get it out of the way, so to speak. Ahavas Yisrael, love a fellow Jew, as it's taught in Hasidus, in my opinion, this is the way I like to say it, because I think this is the most concise and provocative, most direct way to make the point, that the Hasidic focus on the Jew shifted the center of gravity of Judaism away from the practice to the practitioner. What's the most important thing in Judaism? Torah, mitzvahs. In Hasidus, the most important thing in Judaism is the Jew. And the long version of this, you'll have to get a tape to listen to, because we're not talking about it tonight. So the Baal Shem Tov revealed, inspired, taught, initiated a movement that has these two priorities. The most important thing is the person, is the Yid, and the unity of God. Achdus Hashem, the unity of God. Now the belief in the unity of God is not new to Hasidus. Belief in the unity of God is one of the 613 mitzvahs. The first commandment is to believe in God, or to know God according to the Rambam. And the second commandment is to believe in the unity of God, or to know the unity of God. And in the language of the Zohar, the first commandment is to have a basic understanding of God, and the second commandment is to have a very detailed, a very more in-depth understanding of God. And of course, the simple and obvious clarification that is due is that the unity of God does not mean that God is one and not two. There's only one God and not two gods, and that God is simple and not complex. That's all part of the first mitzvah, which is simply to believe in God and to know God. The unity of God means that the world is not separate. Ein oid mulvad. Nothing is outside of God. Nothing is outside of God's jurisdiction. Although there's a creation, and before creation there was no creation, and now that there is a creation, there is something distinct and divided, separated from the Creator. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the unity of God, says in effect, in reality, just like before creation, God was the one and only one, He continues to be the one and only one now as well. The change is only our perception. Achdut Hashem, one of the core teachings and beliefs of Judaism is that God is one. And again, one doesn't mean that He's one and not two. It means He is one and we are not two. Creation is one with God. And it's a mitzvah. And much has been written on this mitzvah. Going back hundreds and hundreds of years, there have been many books that have explored the question of Achdut Hashem, Achdus Hashem. There are different schools of thought, there are different opinions, there are different levels. The Baal Shem Tov came along after all the earlier views had been firmly established, the philosophical view and the mystical view, and he added the Hasidic nuance to the question of the unity of God. And we learned the Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah. The entire second section of Tanya is dedicated to this very question: what does the unity of God mean? The letter we are currently exploring gives us a summary, a very, very, very brief, but almost word for word summation of some of the ideas that we discussed in the Shara Yechid Ve'emunah about the unity of God. The context of this conversation is what we talked about last week. Anger. Anger is a midah. Anger is a bad attribute. It's not a good thing. And of course, anger is, burning up your own engine and hoping the other guy gets hurt, like I explained to you the other day. Rambam writes that anger is one of those midas, one of those attributes, one of those negative character traits that a person must stay away from to the extreme. Usually Rambam is a centrist. Rambam believes don't be too of anything. Don't be too happy or too sad, too generous or too stingy, too available or too reclusive. Everything should be centrist, middle. There are certain character traits that Rambam says one must take an extreme about, and one of them is anger. Now, in dealing with anger, there's different solutions. There is what we would call behavioral modification, where you practice, you do exercises to gain control over your anger. As we talked about last week, when you do behavioral modifications to deal with your anger, you're really dealing with the symptoms, not with the cause. On a higher and a deeper level, there is the philosophy of anger, studying why anger is so destructive and why it's so negative. I mean, the simple truth of the matter is when the moment the person gets angry, his brain is down. It's a machine, the computer's broke. You can't think and reason when you're angry. In this letter, the Alter Rebbe offers us a mystical explanation for the evils of anger. Because anger is usually directed at someone, a human being. And the presumption is that you're angry at that person because that person wronged you. But if we take Achdus Hashem, the unity of God, to its absolute extreme, which is of course what Chassidus does, your anger is misdirected. You shouldn't be angry with the person who wronged you. You should be angry with God. Because in reality, although that person may have exercised free will, that free will itself is b'hashgacha pratit, it's by the divine hand. This was the topic that we delved into last week. That even when somebody with free will chooses to do damage to a fellow, and because they've made that choice, they're going to be responsible, and technically they're going to be punished, and so forth. From your perspective, Hashem Amalek Aleo, that came from God. Of course, this creates a huge conundrum. This is a very terrible paradox. How could it be free will, and yet at the same time it's the hand of God, and so forth and so on. But the short of it is, this is what the Baal Shem Tov teaches. Achdus Hashem, the unity of God, is so whole, is so absolute, that even when another human being exercises bad judgment and does something that's harmful to you, your anger at that person is forgetting that God is the master of the world. This is the gist of this letter. This is a summary, a very short summary of last week's discussion. And as I explained to you then, the Alter Rebbe wrote this letter in defending a teaching from the Holy Baal Shem Tov, which was criticized by the Misnagdim. Alter Rebbe wrote this very, very long letter and said at the end of the letter, I'm giving you one example, where you see that what appears to be simplistic teachings of the Baal Shem Tov are quite profound and entirely consistent with mystical and philosophical teachings. If you want commentary on all the Baal Shem Tov's teachings, you're going to have to come to me and I have to talk to you orally. There's no way I can write it all down. But in the course of this conversation, in discussing, if you will, Hasidus antidote to anger, which is not behavior modification. It's not analyzing the psychology and the philosophy of anger. It's focusing on faith. How do I deal with anger? By strengthening my faith. The stronger my faith in God Almighty is, the less I am prone to, so to speak, lose control, because I recognize that God is the master. Ultimately, what's happening to me in my life is a whole new perspective on anger. And it's quite, through the Hasidic terminology, it's a long, short approach. It's not so simple that the answer to anger is to improve your faith. It's true. But when a person's angry, they're not exactly thinking about faith. When a person's confronted with difficult issues. But this is the Alter Rebbe's point, that the real issue with anger is a misdirected interpreting of what's going on in life, which is a symptom of a lack of faith, and the faith needs to be enhanced. This, in short, is what we talked about last week. And because we're doing the long version of Tanya this time around, as opposed to doing the crunched version of Tanya, we don't have the same kind of pressure. So I'm able to divide this letter into a number of different classes and do it with a considerable amount of additional detail. So what's going to happen tonight, and the way I'm planning it is we're going to finish it next week, of course, by the grace and with the help of God, is I'm going to discuss with you what the Alter Rebbe brings up in his discussion on the unity of God, and how he argues that when you have a proper belief in the unity of God, your anger should be directed at God, and once you realize that the anger should be directed at God, you say God knows best. And I want to give you one little piece of historical information as a background. And perhaps, no promises, perhaps next week I'll delve into it more, but in the meantime, I'm just going to give you a very simple point. You know that when Hasidus emerged, the Eastern European from world was split, was divided. Hasidim and Misnagdim. Hasidim and the so-called opponents of the Hasidim. At the beginning means a long time, probably as long as 70 years, 3 generations. It was a very, very bitter division, very angry division, a very insoluble division. But eventually it subsided, and to be sure, eventually Hasidim and Misnagdim became friends. You know? The Misnagdim realized Hasidim are religious Jews, and the Hasidim realized that the Misnagdim are pious Jews, and everybody was happy. But when Hasidus first emerged, it was an incredible machlokes, a terrible division amongst the Jewish people. This machlokes involved thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were caught up in the flames of this conflict. And clearly there were leaders, there were people who orchestrated, who initiated, who fueled the flames of this dissent. And when you explore the history of this machlokes, two very, very clear pieces to the puzzle emerge. The first is a political part of the puzzle. There was a lot of ego and a lot of angry people in the discussion between Hasidim and Misnagdim because the Hasidim were a threat to them. Whether the Hasidim were a threat to them economically, whether the Hasidim were a threat to them politically, whether the Hasidim were a threat to them based on ego, are details. But there is no doubt that a significant part, or certainly in the later years, of the machlokes of Hasidim and Misnagdim was not based on ideology, it was based on ego. But there was also a very substantial part of the machlokes which was based on principle. Hasidim and Misnagdim disagreed on core beliefs. And there are innumerable examples. Maybe not innumerable, but there's multiple examples. Many examples of what it was that divided Hasidim from Misnagdim that caused the Misnagdim to be so angry. The Hasidim were the new kid on the block. Like I explained to you last week, they had to give credibility to them, to earn their places in the Jewish world. The Misnagdim were holding on to the tradition. They saw the Hasidim as deviant, as making a change. And Hasidus had to earn its credibility in the Eastern European from world, the Orthodox world, as legitimate Jews, notwithstanding the changes that they were making. And like I said, there's many, many examples. They changed the text of prayer. They started using different ritual knives for shechita. They placed incredible emphasis on joy, which was untraditional. They elevated the simple Jew, which to the Misnagdim meant that it was de-emphasizing, it was de-elevating the rabbi and the scholar that was the most important thing in Lithuanian Jewry. And I can go on and on. There are many, many things that Hasidim and Misnagdim disagreed about. They were not little, they were enormous, they were big, they were very, very important. But without a doubt, one of the most important issues, and perhaps the most important issue, was theological. What kind of relationship does God have with this world? What kind of relationship does God have with evil? Or in the mystical term, what kind of relationship does God have with Klippa? And this question is most sensitive when you ask it, what kind of relationship does God have with evil people? Evil human beings, people. The reason it's most sensitive when it comes to that particular aspect is because people have free will. And if God is mixing into free will, then people aren't people. And if God is not mixing into free will, then people are people. And it was an issue which clearly divided Hasidim from Misnagdim. The Misnagdim at that time held as a matter of principle that God and evil don't mix. God and evil, like water and oil, they will never mix. That although it's true God's the creator of the world, and they also believed in the unity of God, that God ultimately is the master of everything, but theologically they worked it out in a way that allowed to explain that God is the creator, God is involved in the creation, and at the same time he is completely removed from evil. You cannot say that God is in evil. You cannot say that God is in spiritual impurity. You cannot say that God is in klipa. You especially cannot say that God is invested in an evil act of an evil person who is exercising free will. In the Hasidic world, it was very different. The Hasidic world made the exact opposite argument. You cannot say that there is any point in creation where God is not invested. Because if you were to say that there's a point in creation where God is not invested, you are separating something from the Creator, and it defies the principles of Achdut Hashem, the unity of God. Now the Misnagdim had their answers. I teach this to my boys, and my boys are all Chassidish Bachrim, so they're not exactly objective. So you discuss it, and they say, wait, how could the Misnagdim have believed what they believed? And I tell them, the Misnagdim were incredible scholars. They believed me, they had very good explanations for their perspective. But this is undoubtedly one of the most serious divisions in separate Hasidim and Misnagdim. Hasidim made it front and center of their theology and their philosophy of life. Ein oid milvadei. There's nothing other than God. There's no place where God is not. He's invested in evil. He's evil, even invested in the evil choice of human beings who act with free will. Well, the Misnagdim said, God forbid, to use their words, to place God Almighty in the garbage can, in a cesspool, in a place of spiritual filth and squalor. And this division, by its very, very nature, was subject to combustion, I guess is the right word, to volatility, to passions, because there's no gray area, If you want to argue about how much salt you have to put on a piece of meat to make it kosher, how much water you need in a mikveh, you want to argue what kind of knife you have to use for shechita, you want to argue about where you should put hoidu before Baruch Shamar or after Baruch Shamar, those are details. But if you want to argue whether God is involved in evil or God is not involved in evil, this is the very fundamentals of what we believe, our 13 principles of faith. And the Misnagdim and the Hasidim were divided in a way which left no place for reconciliation. The Chassid meets the Misnagid, and the Chassid says to the Misnagid, is God Almighty in a church, or in a bathroom, or in some other evil place? And the Misnagid says, God forbid. And the Chassid says to the Misnagid, so then how does the bathroom exist? And he comes up with whatever theological ideas the Misnagdim had. They had this idea of hashgacha. He's not there, but he's overseeing it. And the Chassid says to the Misnagid, you're a heretic. A Misnagid meets a Chassid. It says to the Chassid, is God in the bathroom? Is God in a church? Is God in an evil place? And the Chassid says, absolutely. Not only that, his presence in an evil place is identical to his presence in the Holy of Holies. The only difference is perception. In the Holy of Holies you can see God, and in a bathroom you don't see God. And the Misnagid says to the Chassid, you're a heretic. Now how are you supposed to have a meeting of the minds? Of course, at the helm, at the center, at the heart of this dispute was the great Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, and the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, who disagreed in a polar way on this question. They were at the opposite end of the spectrum. Our Rebbe has a very concise, very consolidated letter where he gathers 4 opinions about this question of tzimtzum. And he says that the Alter Rebbe had one extreme, that God is completely involved, intimately involved in everything. The Vilna Gaon had the opposite extreme, that said God can't possibly be involved in evil. And the way this trickled down to their respective groups of students, had these 2 rabbis met face to face, the world would have been a different place. But when it came to their students and the students of the students, it was a furnace. It was a fire. And this is the issue that the Alter Rebbe is defending here. The philosophy of Achdut Hashem that Hasidus proposes, teaches. Now, I want to say one thing which is not written here, but it's written in the Sharichet V'Emunah. And I'm going to say it very quickly because I don't want to delve into it. And then I'm going to explore the issue that the Alter Rebbe explores here. And as I mentioned to you, I intend on dividing this topic into two classes. Tonight we'll do the basic picture, and with the help of God, of course. Next week we'll do the more involved, the more Kabbalistic, the more mystical, the more subtle, nuance aspects of it. What I want to say first is that one of the core differences between Hasidim and Misnagdim at the time was the question of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum basically means that the world and God are incompatible. We and God can't be in the same space, for the simple reason that our existence is about our ego, God's existence is about God's ego, and there's no room for both egos in the same space. So if we are going to exist, and we're going to exist in a way that we have a self-identity, in other words, the center of our being is going to be our own ego, God's ego cannot be here. So the mystical concept of Tzimtzum was introduced by the Arizal. And Tzimtzum basically means God vacated the space in which the worlds exist. The Misnagdim said that's literally true. Tzimtzum kipshuti. The idea of God vacating the space where our ego is predominant, is prevalent, is literally so. His ego is not here. What about Achdas Hashem? So they had this idea that he's Mashgiach Mamayla, he's Hashgacha, he oversees happening from the world, from the outside, from a distance. Chassidus, on the other hand, says Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshut, which means the notion that God vacated the space of the creation, removed his ego, so there would be space for our ego, is entirely a point of view. That's what we experience. We feel ourselves because we don't see God. But not we don't see God because God isn't here. We don't see God because God doesn't allow us to see him. It's not that he removed himself, but he concealed himself. This small difference is extraordinary. It is very, very, very broad. Saying God isn't here means that we are in some way outside of him. If we are in some way outside of him, a whole bunch of theological questions emerge. Saying God is here and that we are one with God is saying that our entire reality is virtual. We have a perception which is true to us, and if we knew what God knows, we would be in a completely different space. And this was then a core dispute. The greatest Hasidim, the greatest Misnagdim argued about it. Today, this issue was quite popular, not just in Chabad circles, but in amongst many groups of Jews, including Misnagdim, who are starting to study theological parts of Judaism, mysticism, and philosophy, and so forth and so on. And it's still discussed, although without the vehemence, without the vitriol, without the hate, without the intolerance. But nevertheless, it's a question which is quite consuming to people who are involved in the realms of theology. And that's one of a number of Achdus questions that separate the Hasidim from Misnagdim, the question of Tzimtzum. The particular argument that this letter makes, and if I understand it correctly, the argument that I'm about to make is actually a medrash. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov did not invent this idea, he took it from an ancient source. So that means that the Misnagdim could not disagree with it, they agreed with it, but they dealt with it. They resolved the question of God and evil cohabiting in a much more complicated way. It's what we call in our culture Hishavus B'chol Rega. Hitavut B'chol Rega. The notion of the constancy of creation. The idea that every second God Almighty is creating the world from a non-existence into an existence perpetually. Hishavus B'chol Rega. And this is the basic issue of this letter. The more involved issue of this letter is that it may be true that God is constantly creating everything every single second, but he doesn't have the same relationship with everything that he's creating. When he creates holy things, those holy things reflect that they're being created by the Creator. When he creates benign things, those benign things don't cover, but at the same time don't overtly announce that they're created by the Creator. When he creates evil things, there's got to be a mechanism by which he proactively is involved in creating them, and yet their entire identity is in denial of the dependency upon him. And that drama, that complicated issue, is what's discussed in this letter quite elaborately. And like I told you before, the ultimate question is, how do you explain God's involvement in questions which involve man's free will? But we're going to leave that for next week. Tonight we're simply going to explore the fundamental question of the constancy of creation. And the argument goes basically like this. The issue goes basically as follows. Okay? And let's start from a very, very basic introduction. Is there proof that God exists? Is there proof that God exists? If you're asking me my opinion, of course there's proof that God exists. The proof that God exists is us. Everything. Because nothing would be besides for God. And that's quite simply true. You know, people say, well, come up with an original argument. This is the argument. It's good enough. But you understand, and I understand how entangled these questions become because of apparent patterns and laws of nature that seem to explain creation and evolution and time in a gradualistic, self-contained, not dependent kind of a way, and so forth and so on. But that's like the famous story with the fellow who went to town to find out how a train works. You know the story that the people in the shtetl heard that they invented the train. Now the old trains didn't run like the current trains. The current trains run on an electrical cable. In those days they ran on a locomotive, a steam engine, a powerful, powerful iron horse, as they called it, that could schlep 99 wagons full of tons and tons and tons of supplies, hundreds of miles across, Europe and over the mountains and so forth. And the shtetl kid was sent to town to find out how the train works. So he comes back and says, oh, it's brilliant. He says, yeah, tell me about it. He says, well, there's a wagon attached to a cable, and the cable is attached to a second wagon, and when the first wagon pulls, the second wagon is dragged along. Wow, that's quite insightful. But how does the second wagon move? Ooh, that's a good question. And the answer is that the second wagon also has a cable, and it's attached to a third wagon. And when the third wagon moves, it pulls the second wagon, which in turn pulls the first wagon. Brilliant. And how does the third wagon move? Well, that's a great question. And the answer is that at the front of the third car, there's a cable. And then the cable is attached to a fourth wagon. And the wagon pulls, and it pulls the third cable, car which pulls the second. You can understand how this whole conversation went, till they got to the locomotive. So how does the 99th car move? Oh, it's a great question. It's attached to a cable. That cable is attached to a big iron horse that blows steam and makes a lot of noise and whistles, and when it moves, all the 99 cars behind it follow. He says, yeah, do you know how that works? I have no idea how it works. So why do we waste money sending you to Tanya? Came back with no information. For my information, I answered 99% of your question, he says. So if you can get away with answering the fundamental question by introducing such phenomena as eons, time is a great protection against being forced into a theological corner. Well, it's 15 billion years or 13 billion years. Listen, we got a lot to figure out before we get to the beginning. And it's essentially explaining one car, pulling a second car, pulling a third car. In the end, if you haven't explained the locomotive, nothing makes sense. But when we explore this question of is there proof for a creator, there are, from my understanding, two basic arguments. And they're quite different. And I must tell you, we've had this conversation before when we started the Shadichet V'Emunah, but it's okay, it's been so long ago, we can repeat it. The first argument is intelligent design. You look at the universe, you look at the world, you look at a living thing, you see an incredible, an absolutely dazzling measure of elegance and order and perfection and beauty and precision, which absolutely boggles the mind. The best machine makers in history come nowhere close to the genius that's involved in creating a single grain of sand. And when you observe this, you say, wow, look at this order. And of course it's layered, smaller pieces and bigger pieces and bigger pieces and bigger, until you're talking about things you can see with your naked eye, with the five senses. And then it gets as big as, multicellular systems and planets and stars and solar systems and galaxies and clusters of galaxies. It is so extraordinary. It is so amazingly orderly and beautiful and cohesive. To say this is a mistake is, at the very, very least, simplistic. At the very most, it's intellectually dishonest. Come on. You know, the famous story about the king who's an atheist, and he invites the rabbi to discuss religion with him. And as they're sitting, an inkwell spills over, and the king goes out of the room to bring someone in to clean up the ink. So the rabbi takes a piece of paper and he makes a picture of the landscape outside the window. When the king returns, "Oh, I didn't know you were talented as an artist." He says, "No, I didn't do this." "We didn't do it. It wasn't here before. It's here now." He says, "No, when the ink spilled over onto the paper, it took on this shape." And the king says to the rabbi, "Rabbi, you don't expect me to believe that. I mean, by accident, you don't get such beauty." So the rabbi says, if you cannot accept that a drawing on a piece of paper should happen by accident, how can you explain a universe to have occurred entirely by accident? It's completely illogical. Completely illogical. Just doesn't make any sense. And this argument, which is very, very strong, and today it's accepted even in many secular circles, it's called tsura, form, order, or as they call it in English, intelligent design. The argument that says everything we see around us was made by somebody very smart, very orderly, very creative, who's given order to the material of the universe. This is a proof for God, if you will. But this proof for God by itself has a basic limitation. And the limitation that this proof for God has is it doesn't address one of the core questions. And the core question is, where did the material come from? If you speak of God as an organizer, as an artist, the one thing the artist does not do is create the ink. He simply arranges it. If there is a universe that we are attributing to a creator, based on its incredible measure of order, the piece to the puzzle, the aspect that's not being addressed, he is taking primordial matter, stuff, atoms, atomic particles, subatomic particles, small particles, now they call them strings, and organizing them, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And the higher you go, the more, there's a great word, convergent the properties become, and the more the beauty and the elegance and the complexity emerges. So it addresses the art, the creativity, the order in creation. But it doesn't address the fundamental question, where did the building blocks come from? Or to say it in the language of Hasidus, this addresses only the question of yesh miyesh. It does not address the question of yesh miyayin. That means, in other words, it addresses the question, if we assume that there always was primordial stuff, we are giving God credit for organizing it. This is what many secular philosophers believed. This is what Aristotle believed. I think this is what Spinoza believed. They believed in a God, but they saw God simply, as they would say in the world of music, who's the mixer. He takes the complicated components and makes them orderly. But the material itself, that question is not addressed. So they study the order in the universe and say, yeah, quite unlikely for it to have occurred spontaneously, accidentally, randomly. Somebody did it. But when it comes to the fundamental question, where did the stuff of what the universe is made come from, the answer is, I don't know. Or the answer is, as the old philosophers would say, Chomer, Harish, and Kadmon. The material from which the universe was created always existed. Aristotle believed that if there was no material before, there's no way material could have appeared. His philosophy said, God exists. And God's role is to take stuff and make it beautiful. But that stuff, he didn't create. That stuff always existed. In the language of Aristotle, yesh meyayin is nimna. Ex nihilo is impossible. If there was no material, the material couldn't be. If there is material, the material must always have been. And all God is doing is taking the pre-existing material and organizing it. This is called yesh meyesh. He's taking stuff which is by itself chaotic and organizing it. This is the first level of discussing the idea of a creator and the influence of a creator on a creation. And I must tell you that this issue is believed, I think, quite widely. Even in many scientific circles, people are now entertaining the possibility that someone is up there making it all happen. But they're not addressing the real core question. Not who's the organizer of the primordial material. Where did the stuff come from? And this becomes very, very, very important in the Tanya. And before the Tanya, it becomes very, very important to Maimonides. The Nachmanides and the Maimonides and the Moed Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed. The issue which lies at the center of the Moed Nevuchim's theological search is this question. In other words, where he parts direction from Aristotle is this. And the problem is as follows. If you see God as an organizer, then God does not work full time. The stuff exists. He is simply giving order to the stuff. So the primordial material, which is a kadmon, always existed, which is really another way of saying the stuff of creation is God itself, is a God itself. And he's simply taking random, arbitrary, chaotic disorder and organizing it. Once he's given it order, he can go on vacation. What's going to happen? It's going to happen what we all understand in basic laws of physics. It's going to slowly deteriorate. The laws of nature involve entropy. Everything deteriorates. Everything goes from a higher level of order to a lower level of order. But it takes time. And at least once every 10 to 15 billion years, there'll be a really chaotic state. He'll come along with his ladle and with his spatula, and he'll mix it all up and fix it all up and go on vacation again. In other words, if you see God simply as the organizer of the former of primordial stuff, which is a kadmon, it always was, that nobody made, that allows for God's relationship with creation to be at an arm's distance. He gives order to the world and he leaves the world alone. Which of course is antithetical, it's the exact opposite of Achdus Hashem, of the theology of the unity of God. Because as I've been explaining to you, the unity of God means that God is involved in our lives. If all he's doing is taking the primordial material and organizing it, once it's been organized, he leaves it alone until it reaches another level of chaos and he has to fix it again. And the philosophy goes on. Aristotle's philosophy extends further and makes the case that not only is it not necessary for God to be involved in the creation, but it's in fact impossible for God to be involved in the creation. That's to do with the so-called perfection of God. I'm not here to teach you Aristotle. You want to read Aristotle, you have to find somebody else. But then comes the second argument. The second argument is the religious argument. The second argument is Maimonides' argument, Rambam's argument. And the Alter Rebbe begins the Tanya, this is how I see it, where Maimonides finished off. The Tanya, the Shara, Yichud Muna, the theology of Achdus we have in the Tanya begins with the Rambam finished. The Rambam zeroes in on this question and asks the question, where did the material, where did the chomer, the atoms, the tiniest, most elemental components of the material that makes up the universe, where did that come from? And the philosophers said, we don't know. The philosopher said it always existed. The philosopher said, but God's not doing anything about that. And the Rambam said, that's the real question. And the Rambam says, it is impossible to say that anything physical should be forever. Period. Everything physical, everything complex, everything made up of parts must ultimately have a beginning and have an end. This is philosophical argument. Now it's a long story, it's a sensitive story. The Rambam is very careful how he makes his argument. But the end of the day is Rambam introduces a whole new dimension to the so-called proof of God. And that is the proof that God exists is not only that the universe has order, but the proof that God exists is the simple fact that the universe exists. In other words, he's not only taking primordial material and organizing it, he's actually creating it. And before he created it, it did not exist. Or alternatively, before he created it, it was God. This is called yesh me'ayin, spontaneous creation. From nothing into something, or to be more precise, from a non-thing into an independent thing. The word yesh connotes independence. Rambam is very particular about how he makes this argument because he wants to be consistent with the philosophical rules. In other words, he's very careful not to become simplistic in his arguments. But the conclusion he says at the end of the day is these are his words, it's far more likely to accept the theory of yesh me'ayin than to accept the theory of yesh me'ayin nimna. Aristotle believed if nothing existed, nothing will continue to exist. You can't create something from nothing. And Rambam said, the world we see once wasn't. And God created it not from primordial matter, but from nothing. And this is the second basic proof for God. The first proof for God is the order in the universe, and this is very easy to argue and to explain. But it avoids the most fundamental question of, where did we come from? It simply explains how we became what we are, but not where we came from fundamentally, basically. The second question addresses not just where we came from, who made us into what we are, but the question of from where we became. Yesh me'ayin. So the Alter Rebbe begins the Tanya's thesis on the unity of God where Rambam finishes it off. And he makes the next logical step in the developing of the theology of Achdus Hashem, and that is, once we've gone through step 1, which is that God is the organizer, and we've graduated to step 2, which is God is the actual creator, you get to a very necessary step 3. And step 3 says, you cannot create from nothing. You cannot create spontaneously once and leave it alone. If this stuff existed, and you're simply organizing it, the stuff existed before you, the stuff will exist after you. You organize it and leave it alone. But if you're the creator of the stuff itself, it has to be renewed. B'chol rega v'rega. Every second God recreates the material of creation from a non-existent to an existence, or it would simply vanish. And the logic to this is quite simple. And the Alter Rebbe gives philosophical arguments, and he also brings biblical proofs to this, to support this hypothesis, this theory, this teaching. And it's very, very simply this. Whenever you change something, you can change it in 2 degrees. You can change it in a way that is part of its nature, and you can change it in a way which is a violation of its nature. For example, if I have water in a bowl, and I put the water into a cup, I have changed the shape of the water, but I haven't changed the nature of the water. The nature of water is it's adhesive, it sticks to other water particles, and it wants to go to the lowest point. The vessel holds the water in one shape or another, same water. What if I wanted the water to stand without a cup? I want the water to be in the shape of a cup or a barrel or a wall, but I'm not providing the supports. That's unnatural. It goes against the basic laws of a fluid, of water. Water wants to fall, water wants to tumble, water wants to go to the lowest point. To have water stand vertically in a column or in a wall and not fall without support is changing the nature of the water. Can it be done? Sure, it can be done. With wind. You can use very, very strong winds that can come from certain angles and that can preserve the shape of water against its nature. But one thing is absolutely true. That wind can't blow once, because the minute that wind subsides, the water goes back to being water. If you want the water to retain that shape, the wind must blow perpetually. And that's what happened when the sea split, when the Jews crossed at Yam Suf. The Torah describes wind that made the water stand like as though it were in a barrel, as though it were made of brick stones, but it was water. There was no plastic. There was no artificial support to keep the water vertical as opposed to being horizontal. And if the wind that supported the shape of the water would subside for an instant, it would be what it naturally is. So when you change something within the limitations of its nature, it's not a big deal. When you change something that's defiant of its nature, it's a very big deal. And the difference is, when you're changing something within the framework of its own nature, you change it and it's changed. You change something to go against its nature, you have to perpetually preserve that change. For example, take a piece of silver. There was a spoon, and you make it into a cup. You don't have to stand there every second and make it be a cup, because silver is a solid. And as long as it maintains the basic laws of chemistry that conform to what silver is at this temperature, under this pressure, big deal. But if you want silver to be a fluid, to be a gas, you can't heat it up once. You're changing the nature of it. It has to be preserved perpetually. Now, if you believe in Yesh Meyesh, if you believe that the primordial matter, the primordial material of creation always was, what is God doing? He's taking stuff that already exists, and to use a modern term, that has physical laws that govern, has physical properties, and exploiting them, using those physical things as they conform to their physical laws to create order. So since he's using material that already exists, and his own rules, and he's manipulating those things based on the limitations of the rules of those beings as they are, God makes his world and he's on to vacation. But if God is making the material itself, from what is he making the material? From himself. There is nothing more unnatural than making from what was, in the language of Kabbalah, the Word of God, a physical atom. There's nothing more unnatural, nothing more changing the nature of something than taking, in effect, a piece of godliness, a piece of bittul, a piece of complete awareness of God, into being a being that's by its very nature denial of God. Therefore, when you appreciate step 2 of the God argument, which follows step 1 of the God argument. Step 1 of the God argument is Yesh Miyesh Natsura, giving order to creation. Step 2 of the God argument is Yesh Miyayin, creating the material of the universe ex nihilo, after nothing, which is a spontaneous event of creation. You get to the third step in creation, which is his havas b'chol regel. He has to do it every instant. So the Alter Rebbe says, I'm asking you a question. If God is renewing creation every instant, on the atomic level, on the subatomic level, on the sub-subatomic level, and one person, this is another person, exactly who dissed who? If God would not at that moment create that person and provide him with the personality and the tendencies and the disposition and the mood and the circumstance which elicits from within him anger or destructiveness or violence or vile language, he simply would vanish. If God didn't create us every second, we wouldn't crumble into atomic disarray. We would disappear. Because we're not talking about the dimension, the level, the stage of giving order to chaotic particles. We're talking about creating the parts itself. So the Rebbe says, when we exist, every second we are being renewed, literally from a non-existential state, from not being, or from being God, into being what we are. That's renewed every instant. So who shall our anger be directed at? That's the argument. If we understand the dynamics of Achdus, this is not even the highest level of Achdus. There are much higher, deeper concepts of unity that says, Yesh Me'ayin, creation once was not and now it is yes. Once we appreciate that initial principle, that leads us to the subsequent principle, which argues has to be renewed every second. So when somebody hurts you and you get angry at that person, the anger should be directed not at that person but at the Creator. Although we have a perception that's inconsistent with that at all. It's totally incompatible with that. I mean, if we thought of the idea that God is creating us from a non-existence to an existence every second, we would have a nervous breakdown every second. I mean, just think about the nerve. What happens if in 1 minute now God decides he's making the whole universe except for me? Right? Of course, the answer is he's not likely to do that, as they say in scientific circles. But if you seriously contemplate what it means that every instant that we exist is a new individual act of our Creator to make us be, it's awesome how dependent we are upon Him and consequently how our sense of our lives in the universe and in relationship with other people should be. There's a Zohar that relates, one of the great sages of the great Tanoim of the Zohar, who had a habit that before he would eat, the food would be sitting in front of him, and he would ask God for his meal. And of course it was the biggest joke. Food sitting in front of you, ask God for your meal. So of course there's a number of interpretations, some more spiritual than others. Some say he asked God for his meal. He wanted to make sure that the food he had in front of him was his and not somebody else's. Sometimes the wires get crossed. I want to have the food that Hashem has prepared for me, not for somebody else. But on the other argument is, what happens if in a minute from now God creates me again from nothing into something, and he chooses not to make my sweet potato? Then I'm not going to have what to eat. So he's praying to God, God, if in a minute from now you choose to make me again from nothing into something, make my food also, I should be able to eat it. This is the broad argument. This is the basic argument. The basic argument says that since we understand God's relationship to the world in these two steps, yesh mi yesh, that means he gives order and organization, what they call the intelligent designer. Moreover, we believe in yesh me'ayin, and spontaneous newness. Today scientists are asking the question, so what happened before the Big Bang? And of course, the one thing they're not prepared to entertain is the thought that maybe God is responsible for it. In other words, that before the Big Bang there was nothing. They want to speak about parallel universes and universes following universes, and millions and billions and trillions of accidents, and we're just the one that worked out, and all the other random, chaotic, theoretical arguments that refuse to make that step that says we once did not exist, period, and now we are. Yesh b'yai, which leads to the next step, that God creating us every second. If we reach that point, we not only acknowledge a creator, we acknowledge what's called in philosophy an immanent creator, an involved creator. He's not on vacation. He goes on vacation, we go into non-existence. And therefore, our lives are intimately governed by God. Now, of course, you don't need me to tell you that as a philosophy, in a classroom, this is brilliant. In day-to-day life, this is virtually impossible. To live our lives with the sense that everything that happens to us literally is coming directly by the hand of God, which is really true, is such a high level. It's the level of the holiest of people. The greatest of people, like the story that you have with Nochamish Gamzu, everybody knows, right? Right? You know what Nochamish Gamzu was. The Gemara talks about Nochamish Gamzu. He was a rabbi, a holy man. And he was, in the language of the Gemara, Melumad ben Nisim. Miracles happened to him like we breathe air and drink water. Miracles were part of his everyday life. So, but the Jews needed to send tribute to the Roman Caesar. The Roman Caesars were such wonderful, wonderful people. They were kind and sensitive and loving, and so they wanted to send them a gift of tribute, right? So they shouldn't take their heads off, to be very blunt. And they said, Nochamish Gamzu is Melumad Benisim. Nochamish Gamzu was used to miracles. Let's make him the emissary. Problem is, people who are used to miracles are not exactly that attentive to such details as chests full of diamonds. You understand? He came to a hotel and he put this chest full of diamonds in the safe. In the morning, it was filled with earth. The proprietor of the hotel checked it out and figured he's going to, borrow the precious stones for an indefinite period of time. Nochamish Gamzu is up in the morning, looks into the box, and the diamonds are gone. So he says to himself, Gamzu L'Teva, this is also God. The diamonds are God and the earth is God. No difference whatsoever. And he takes the earth to the palace and he presents it to the king, and they want to chop his head off. What a disrespect. Earth! So Elijah the prophet makes an appearance, the Gemara says, and he says to the king of Rome, perhaps this is that miracle earth that Abraham threw at the 4 kings that we read about in Parshas Lech Lecha last 2 weeks ago. And they tried it. And guess what? It was the miracle earth, right? What was the miracle earth? Nochamish Gamzu's faith. That was the miracle earth. Because in his world, everything was governed by God. Everything was in fact governed by God. Then of course the end of the story is on his way home, he stops at the same hotel. And he's coming back with honor and with pomp, and they're giving him all kinds of gifts. And the proprietor says to him, ooh, what's Laha's life? Wonderful. He says, you went to the palace? Sure. You delivered the diamonds? He says, sure. What happened? Look, they gave me this entourage, they gave me all this wealth. He says, really? But there was earth in the chest. He says, yes, somebody came in and said that the earth had magic properties, it can wipe out armies, and they tried it out on one of the Roman many enemies, and sure enough, it defeated them. So the guy takes his house down, digs up wagon loads of this magic earth, brings it to the palace and deposits it to the Roman Caesar, and of course you understand what happened. Because it was Nachamish Gamzu's perception that was realized when this earth turned into a miraculous earth, because to him it wasn't a miracle. To him it was really the hand of God renewing creation every second. How many of us are going to bring a chest full of diamonds only to find them to be filled with sand and walk into President Obama and deliver him a gift and say, Gamzu l'Tanya. So in theory it's true, in reality it's a test. And the struggle of our lives as believers, as faith-based people, is exactly this. How do we translate these concepts into our day-to-day living? And it's an awesome undertaking. And of course, in the context of this conversation, it's anger. Anger is very, very self-destructive. Not to mention that it's destructive to the people around us as well. And to our reputation, forget about it. But anger is rooted in a sense of helplessness. Anger is rooted in the sense of feeling violated, which is rooted in the sense of a world that is out of control. And we believe that there's no such thing as out of control. The remaining part of this discussion, which is the more mystical part, we start speaking about different perceptions, different realities. And in higher realities, the presence of God, then his influence in the creation is much more overt. And in lower realities, the presence of God and the perception of his involvement is much more subliminal, until that in evil itself, what is the meaning of evil from a mystical perspective? The denial of the Creator. It's sustained by the Creator himself in a convoluted, in a complicated mystical method that allows for these two opposites to coexist. That on the one hand, God is perpetually involved, on the other hand, it's perpetually in denial of him.